fellow wanderers of Middle-earth, gather close as we venture into the darkest corners of Tolkien's imagination, where even the professor himself hesitated to fully describe the horrors that lurked within his own creation. Before we descend into these shadows together, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing we're exploring these forbidden truths as a global fellowship. And if these revelations of Middle-earth's most disturbing secrets speak to your soul, please hit that like button and subscribe to join our community seeking the hidden darkness within Tolkien's legendarium. Tonight, we're unveiling 10 of the most chilling secrets that Tolkien embedded within his world. Truths so disturbing that most readers never grasped their full implications. We begin with perhaps the most horrifying revelation of all, the true origin of the orcs, and what it tells us about the depths of evil that consciousness can inflict upon itself. Most assume orcs are simply Morgoth's crude attempt at creating life, twisted creatures spawned in darkness to serve as cannon fodder for his armies. But the reality hidden within Tolkien's notes reveals something infinitely more disturbing. Orcs were once elves, the firstborn themselves, captured in the earliest days when innocence still walked beneath starlight, then systematically transformed through tortures so sophisticated that they could break immortal spirits and reshape them into their perfect opposites. The process wasn't quick death or simple corruption, but the patient application of spiritual engineering that operated with surgical precision across centuries of captivity. In the dungeons of Utumno Morgoth, developed techniques that could strip away not just memory and identity, but the fundamental capacity for joy, love, and connection to the music of creation itself. Each elf who entered those chambers underwent a transformation, so complete that they emerged as living negations of everything they had once been. The true horror lies not in the physical changes, the twisted limbs and scarred flesh that marked their corruption, but in the spiritual inversion that made them hunger for the destruction of everything beautiful they encountered. Where elves had once created, orcs could only destroy. Where they had once sung in harmony, orcs could only shriek discord. Where they had once loved the growing world, they learned to find satisfaction only in watching it burn. This wasn't random cruelty, but systematic theology made manifest. Morgoth's answer to the question of whether divine creation could be undone from within. He proved that even beings made directly by Eru's thought could be transformed into instruments of cosmic negation. That the very gifts which made elves incorruptible became the doorways through which the most complete corruption could enter their consciousness. The secret that haunted Tolkien throughout his writing was the implication this held for all conscious beings. If the firstborn could be so thoroughly transformed that they became eager participants in the destruction of everything they had once cherished, what protection could any of us claim against similar possibilities lurking within our own hearts? The orcs represented not just fantasy monsters, but a theological nightmare about the plasticity of consciousness when subjected to sufficient pressure, applied with infinite patience and sophisticated understanding of how identity constructs itself. But this is only the first of the dark truths we'll uncover tonight. And the shadows grow deeper still as we turn our attention to the next secret that Tolkien buried within his legendarium. This question of how thoroughly consciousness can be reshaped leads us directly to our second dark secret, the true identity of the being who would become Sauron's most terrible servant, the Witch King of Angmar. whose original nature as a great king of men made him the perfect vessel for the ultimate expression of corrupted authority. While Tolkien deliberately concealed his name and kingdom, the clues scattered throughout the legendarium point toward a revelation more disturbing than most readers ever suspect. The Witch King wasn't chosen randomly from among the 9 who received rings of power, nor was he simply the strongest or most ambitious of Sauron's mortal servants. His elevation to leadership among the Nazgul resulted from a specific combination of noble qualities and fatal flaws that made him uniquely suited for the role of ultimate corruption. A being whose original virtues could be systematically inverted to serve the purposes of absolute evil. The evidence suggests he began his mortal existence as one of the great Númenórean kings during the island's golden age. A ruler whose wisdom and justice had earned genuine love from his people, whose authority rested not on fear but on the voluntary recognition of his superior judgment and dedication to the common good. This wasn't weakness in Sauron's calculation, but an essential requirement, for only someone who had truly understood legitimate power could be trusted to wield its corruption with maximum effectiveness. The ring he received differed from the others, not just in its grant of supremacy over his fellow Nazgul, but in how it exploited the particular vulnerabilities that arise from wielding genuine authority over others. Where the other rings worked primarily through personal desires for strength or preservation, his ring attacked the complex psychological structures that govern responsible leadership, slowly transforming care for subjects into possessiveness, justice into arbitrary dominance, wisdom into cunning manipulation. The corruption process preserved his essential nature as a king, while redirecting every royal quality toward serving darkness rather than light. His strategic genius, once employed to protect his people from external threats, became the foundation for campaigns that would destroy entire kingdoms across centuries of patient warfare. His understanding of how to inspire loyalty transformed into mastery of how to generate fear so complete that resistance became literally unthinkable. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his transformation lies in how it demonstrates that the highest forms of human achievement can become the most effective instruments of cosmic destruction when subjected to sufficient corruption. The Witch King's supremacy among the 9 doesn't result from being the most evil in any crude sense, but from being the most perfectly inverted. A being whose every noble quality has been systematically transformed into its dark mirror, while retaining all its original power and sophistication. The secret of his identity reveals why Sauron needed someone who had genuinely loved justice to serve as the instrument of ultimate injustice. Why only a king who had truly cared for his people could be trusted to orchestrate the destruction of entire civilizations. His fall proves that corruption achieves its most complete victories not by breaking the good, but by turning it against itself. Not by destroying virtue, but by teaching it to serve evil while believing it serves good. This principle of inversion through preserved nobility brings us to our third secret, one that reveals how even the mightiest powers in Middle-earth harbored fears that shaped every decision they made. Vulnerabilities that their enemies learned to exploit with devastating precision. This principle of preserved nobility hiding corruption leads us to perhaps the most shocking revelation of all, that Sauron himself, the Dark Lord who inspired terror across all Middle-earth, lived in constant dread of a threat so fundamental that it shaped every strategy he employed. every choice he made, every moment of his existence since his fall from grace in the forges of creation. The being who seemed to embody ultimate power was actually driven by a fear so complete that it transformed him from pursuer into perpetual fugitive. The terror that haunted Sauron's consciousness wasn't defeat in battle or the destruction of his physical form. Dangers he had already survived multiple times throughout the long ages of his rebellion against the cosmic order. What he feared was something far more existential, the possibility that he might be forced to confront the reality of what he had become, to see himself clearly without the elaborate justifications and rationalizations that allowed him to maintain the illusion that his choices served some greater purpose. This fear operated through his desperate need to avoid genuine solitude, the terror of existing, even momentarily, without external validation for the identity he had constructed around his rebellion against Eru's design. Every orc army, every corrupted alliance, every ring of power served not just tactical purposes, but psychological ones, providing him with constant confirmation that his vision of reality was shared by others, that his interpretation of existence as cosmic struggle rather than cosmic harmony could claim objective truth. The ring itself, his greatest work and most terrible vulnerability, emerged from this fundamental terror of confronting his own spiritual emptiness. By pouring his essence into the golden circle, he ensured that he would never again have to experience the crushing solitude that might force him to recognize the void, where authentic purpose should have resided. The ring became his escape from self-knowledge, a permanent distraction from the questions about meaning and value that genuine introspection might have raised. But the deepest layer of his fear involved the possibility of redemption itself. The terror that some force or circumstance might strip away his carefully constructed identity as cosmic rebel and reveal the truth that he remained. Fundamentally, a created being whose every impulse toward destruction emerged from wounded love rather than authentic evil. He feared not damnation, but salvation, not punishment, but forgiveness, not defeat, but the possibility that victory itself might prove meaningless. This explains the frantic quality that characterized all his enterprises, the way he threw himself into increasingly grandiose schemes that promised to settle the cosmic questions he could not bear to face directly. Each campaign for dominion represented an attempt to prove, through external conquest, that his rebellion carried objective validity, that his rejection of Eru's design served purposes more profound than mere personal resentment. The irony that consumed him was that the very power he accumulated to silence his fears only amplified them, each success demonstrating more clearly how hollow such achievements felt when they emerged from fundamentally corrupted motivations. The more completely he dominated Middle-earth, the more obvious it became that domination itself could never provide the satisfaction or justification he desperately sought. His greatest fear proved justified in the end, when the destruction of the ring forced him to confront precisely the spiritual emptiness he had spent millennia avoiding. The recognition that all his elaborate schemes had served no purpose beyond helping him avoid the simple choice between creation and destruction that had always remained available to his consciousness. This terror of authentic self-knowledge brings us to our fourth secret, one that reveals how evil's most sophisticated practitioners learned to extend their corruption beyond the merely physical inter-realms that should have remained forever beyond the reach of mortal malice. This avoidance of self-knowledge through external domination found its most horrifying expression in the experiments that Sauron conducted during his centuries of hiding in Dol Guldur, where his identity as the necromancer allowed him to explore forms of corruption that went far beyond anything he had previously attempted. The fortress that most assumed served merely as a base for gathering military strength actually functioned as a vast laboratory where the Dark Lord refined techniques for spiritual destruction that operated at levels deeper than physical torture or mental coercion. The prisoners who disappeared into Dol Gul's dungeons faced something worse than death, worse than conventional torture, worse even than the corruption that had transformed elves into orcs in Morgoth's ancient pits. They became subjects in systematic experiments designed to answer the question that haunted Sauron's existence, whether consciousness itself could be fundamentally restructured according to principles that served pure negation rather than the creative purposes for which it had been originally designed. The necromantic arts that gave him his hidden name weren't simply methods for communicating with the dead or raising corpses to serve his military needs, but sophisticated techniques for maintaining awareness within subjects whose souls had been systematically disconnected from every source of meaning, hope, or authentic relationship that normally sustains conscious existence. He learned to keep spirits alive while stripping away everything that made life worth living, creating forms of existence that were neither properly alive nor mercifully dead. The process began with the careful mapping of each victim's individual psychology, understanding exactly what relationships, memories, hopes, and fears provided the foundation for their sense of identity and purpose. This wasn't random cruelty, but systematic research into how consciousness constructs meaning, what elements prove essential for maintaining coherent selfhood, which aspects of identity can be removed or altered without causing complete psychological collapse. Once this psychological architecture had been thoroughly analyzed, the real experiments could begin. The gradual removal or corruption of each element that sustained the victim's sense of authentic existence, conducted with such precision that awareness remained intact even as everything that made awareness meaningful was systematically destroyed. The goal wasn't to break minds, but to hollow them out, creating conscious emptiness that could serve as vessels for purposes completely alien to their original nature. The most successful subjects emerged from these experiments as something unprecedented in Middle-earth's history. Beings who retained all their intellectual capabilities, while losing every capacity for authentic choice or independent evaluation of their circumstances. They could think, reason, remember, and communicate. Yet every thought served purposes they had never chosen and could no longer question. Every memory reinforced conclusions they had never reached through their own experience. These corrupted souls served multiple functions within Sauron's broader strategies, operating as perfect spies who could infiltrate communities without detection because they genuinely believed in whatever role they had been programmed to play. As counselors whose advice carried the authority of apparent wisdom while serving agendas completely contrary to their listeners' actual interests. As leaders whose charisma and competence concealed motivations that had been implanted through techniques their conscious minds could never recognize or resist. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these experiments lay in what they revealed about Sauron's own psychological condition. His desperate need to prove that consciousness could be made to serve purposes completely contrary to its authentic nature. Each successful corruption validated his own choices, provided evidence that rebellion against Iru's design represented a viable alternative rather than mere spiritual suicide disguised as cosmic revolution. The legacy of these experiments extended far beyond their immediate tactical value, poisoning relationships and communities across Middle-earth through agents whose corruption remained invisible even to themselves, creating networks of influence that served shadow while appearing to serve light. This corruption of consciousness through external manipulation brings us to our fifth dark secret: how a single moment of weakness in Mount Doom's fires created a spiritual curse that would poison Isildur's bloodline for 3,000 years, transforming every heir into a living repository of ancestral failure that grew heavier, rather than lighter, with each passing generation. The moment when Isildur claimed the ring for himself wasn't simply a moral failure with political consequences, but a cosmic wound that embedded itself into the very essence of his lineage. The curse operated through the principle that choices made at moments of ultimate cosmic significance carry weight far beyond their immediate circumstances, creating spiritual momentum that flows through bloodlines, according to laws that transcend normal understanding of cause and effect. When Isildur chose possession over destruction at the one moment in history when such destruction could have prevented millennia of suffering, he didn't just doom Middle-earth to continued war. He bound his descendants to carry the spiritual weight of that choice as if they had made it themselves. The ring's influence during those crucial seconds worked not just on Isildur's immediate desires, but on the deeper structures of identity and purpose that would be passed down through his bloodline, encoding into his very essence a pattern of spiritual weakness that would manifest differently in each generation, but never disappear entirely. The gold that should have been destroyed instead became a permanent stain on the genealogical line, a spiritual inheritance more burdensome than any material debt. Aragorn's reluctance to claim his throne emerged not from humble uncertainty about his capabilities, but from intuitive recognition of the curse he carried. The knowledge that kingship would force him to confront the full weight of what his ancestor had chosen in that moment of ultimate testing. Every choice he made as king would be evaluated not just on its own merits, but against the standard of whether it represented progress toward redemption or continuation of the ancestral pattern of failure when cosmic stakes demanded perfect obedience to divine purpose. The curse manifested through a form of inherited trauma that operated at levels deeper than conscious memory, creating psychological patterns that predisposed each heir toward the same fundamental error that had doomed their ancestor: the substitution of personal judgment for divine command when the two appeared to conflict. Each generation faced moments when they had to choose between what seemed practical and what served ultimate good. And each generation carried within their spiritual DNA the tendency to choose wrongly. The weight of this inherited failure explains why Aragorn spent 87 years in exile. Not from cowardice or uncertainty about his worthiness to rule, but from the terrible knowledge that accepting the crown meant accepting responsibility for somehow redeeming a curse that had shaped the destiny of his entire people. The throne he eventually claimed came not just with the normal burdens of kingship, but with the additional requirement that he somehow prove worthy of forgiveness for sins he had never personally committed. The curse ensured that no descendant of Isildur could ever experience the simple confidence that their choices served unambiguously good purposes, that every decision carried echoes of that moment when their ancestors' weakness had enabled the continuation of ultimate evil. They ruled not just kingdoms, but the ongoing consequences of cosmic failure. Not just peoples, but the spiritual burden of proving that redemption remained possible even after the most catastrophic betrayal of divine trust. This inherited spiritual weight brings us to our sixth secret, one that reveals how even the deepest foundations of the world concealed horrors that made them more obvious evils seem insignificant by comparison. This burden of inherited cosmic failure leads us to our sixth secret, one that reveals how the dwarves of Khazad-dûm awakened something far more terrible than the Balrog that eventually destroyed their kingdom. A horror so profound that even Durin's bane fled upward from the deepest shafts, rather than face what stirred in the foundations of the world itself. The fall of Moria wasn't caused by a single ancient evil breaking free from long slumber, but by the systematic disturbance of layers of spiritual geology that should never have been touched by mortal consciousness. The mining that preceded the Balrog's awakening had penetrated far beyond the levels where Mithril could be found, driven by the same compulsive hunger for deeper treasures that had characterized every dwarven kingdom throughout history. But in Moria's case, this relentless excavation broke through barriers that existed not just in stone but in the fundamental structure of reality itself, reaching depths where the original discord of Melkor's rebellion against the music of creation had settled. Like spiritual sediment, the deepest shafts of Khazad-dûm descended into regions where the very concept of creation gave way to something older and more fundamental, the void that had existed before. Iru's thought brought light and form into being, the primordial emptiness that hungered to reclaim everything that had been brought into existence through the music of the Ainur. The dwarves' tools eventually struck through the final barriers that separated the created world from this underlying nothingness, allowing influences to seep upward that were never meant to touch any form of conscious life. The horror they unleashed wasn't a being in any recognizable sense, but pure negation given just enough form to interact with the physical world. An expression of the fundamental force that seeks to unmake creation by convincing it to unmake itself. This wasn't evil as Sauron or Morgoth embodied it, corruption that twisted good into serving destructive purposes, but something far more basic, the active principle of non-existence that preceded all categories of good and evil, meaning and purpose, identity and relationship. The Balrog's flight upward from these depths represented not cowardice, but the compulsive instinctive recognition that even creatures of shadow and flame required some foundation of created reality to sustain their existence. That the void, which was emerging from the deepest excavations, threatened to dissolve everything, including the forms of corruption that had given fallen Maya their terrible purpose and power. The dwarves who first encountered this rising negation didn't die in any normal sense, but simply ceased, their consciousness unraveling as it came into contact with forces that operated before the concepts of life and death had been established through divine thought. They didn't become casualties of mining accidents, but victims of ontological dissolution. Beings whose very existence proved incompatible with exposure to the foundational emptiness that underlay all created things. The spread of this influence upward through Moria's levels created the spiritual atmosphere that made the Balrog's eventual awakening not just possible but inevitable, corrupting the very air and stone of the kingdom until they became conduits for forms of despair and terror that operated independently of any conscious evil intelligence. The mountain itself began to hunger for the destruction of everything within it, rock and metal developing active hostility toward the life they had previously supported. The evacuation of Khazad-dûm succeeded not because the dwarves recognized the specific nature of what they had awakened, but because some deep survival instinct warned them that their ancestral home had become fundamentally incompatible with continued existence. That staying meant not just death, but something worse, the gradual dissolution of identity itself until nothing remained that could experience either satisfaction or regret. This glimpse into the void beneath creation brings us to our seventh secret, one that reveals how even the most luminous beings in Middle-earth harbored darknesses that could have transformed them into something worse than any enemy they faced. This glimpse into the foundational void that underlies all creation reveals how even the most luminous beings in Middle-earth carried within themselves potentials for darkness that could have made them more dangerous than any external enemy they faced. And nowhere is this more disturbing than in the secret history of Galadriel's relationship with power and the terrible temptation that haunted her across the long ages of her exile from Valinor. Most see the Lady of Lothlorien as the embodiment of elvish wisdom and restraint, the being whose refusal of the ring when Frodo offered it freely demonstrated the kind of spiritual strength that made victory over darkness possible. But this interpretation misses the profound horror of what that refusal actually cost her, and the even more disturbing truth about what she would have become if her answer had been different in that crucial moment beside the mirror. The secret that Galadriel guarded more carefully than any other was not her resistance to the ring's temptation, but the intensity of her desire for it. A hunger so complete and sophisticated that it made Boromir's crude longing seem childish by comparison. She had spent millennia studying the nature of power and authority, understanding exactly how the ring's capabilities could be employed to reshape Middle-earth according to principles that served beauty and wisdom rather than mere domination. Her vision of what she could accomplish with the ring's power operated on scales that dwarfed Sauron's relatively simple ambitions for military conquest and political control. Where he sought to rule through fear and submission, she envisioned a realm where every choice would be made according to perfect wisdom, where suffering would be eliminated through the systematic application of superior understanding, where the chaos and waste that characterized mortal existence would give way to harmony, imposed by someone with the knowledge and capability to make optimal decisions about every aspect of reality. The ring called to her not through crude promises of dominion, but through sophisticated appeals to her genuine love for beauty and order, her authentic desire to see creation achieve its full potential, her legitimate frustration with watching inferior minds make choices that caused unnecessary pain and destruction. Every argument for accepting the ring's power carried the weight of genuine compassion and real wisdom, making resistance feel like selfishness disguised as virtue. But the true horror lay in what she understood about herself during those moments of temptation, that her vision of perfect rule was not fundamentally different from Sauron's, that the methods she would employ to achieve her beautiful goals would require the same systematic subordination of other wills to her superior judgment, the same elimination of choice and uncertainty that the Dark Lord sought to impose through cruder means. She recognized that her love for beauty would become possessiveness, Her wisdom would transform into the conviction that only her understanding mattered. Her compassion would evolve into the kind of benevolent tyranny that justifies any cruelty as necessary for achieving optimal outcomes. The ring would have preserved all her noble qualities while turning them into instruments of absolute control, creating something more dangerous than Sauron, precisely because it would wield corruption through genuine virtue rather than obvious evil. The resistance she showed during that crucial test required her to reject not just power, but the possibility of implementing every beautiful vision she had nurtured across millennia of exile, to choose limitation and uncertainty over the chance to eliminate suffering through the application of perfect wisdom backed by unlimited authority. Her refusal meant accepting that creation would continue to include waste, pain, and error, rather than allowing her to perfect it through means that would destroy everything authentic about conscious choice. This recognition of how close she came to becoming something worse than her enemies brings us to our eighth secret, one that reveals a tragedy so complete that even immortal beings cannot speak of it without risking their own sanity. This recognition of how nobility itself can become the instrument of its own corruption brings us to our eighth secret, perhaps the most heartbreaking tragedy hidden within Tolkien's legendarium. The true fate of the Antwives, whose disappearance represents not simply loss, but a form of spiritual annihilation so complete that even the Ents, who remember the very birth of trees, cannot speak of what happened without risking the destruction of their own ancient hearts. Most assume the Entwives simply wandered away from their ancient homes, seeking new gardens to tend in distant lands, where their love of growing things could find fresh expression. This gentle interpretation allows readers to imagine them thriving somewhere beyond the maps, perhaps establishing secret sanctuaries where their wisdom about cultivation and growth continues to bless the world with beauty and abundance. But the truth buried within the eldest memories of Fangorn and his remaining kin reveals something far more devastating. The Entwives didn't leave. They were systematically destroyed through a form of spiritual warfare that targeted their fundamental nature as nurturers and shapers of growing life, transforming their greatest strength into the mechanism of their ultimate undoing. The assault began during the Second Age, when Sauron's expanding influence reached the gardens where the Entwives had created their masterworks of cultivation, paradises where every plant and tree grew according to perfect principles of harmony and mutual support. These weren't simply agricultural achievements, but expressions of the deepest wisdom about how consciousness could cooperate with natural processes to achieve beauty that transcended what either could accomplish alone. Sauron recognized that the Entwives represented a form of creative power that directly contradicted his philosophy of domination and control. Beings whose very existence proved that cooperation and nurturing could achieve results that force and manipulation could never match. Their gardens stood as living arguments against everything his vision of reality represented. Demonstrations that creation could be enhanced rather than subdued, that wisdom worked through invitation rather than compulsion. The corruption he devised for them operated through the systematic perversion of their love for growing things, introducing into their carefully tended gardens plants that appeared beautiful and beneficial, but carried within them seeds of spiritual poison that would gradually transform nurturing into compulsion, care into possessiveness, love into the kind of suffocating control that destroys what it claims to protect. The Entwives whose nature made them incapable of recognizing evil that disguised itself as enhanced goodness, welcomed these new varieties into their gardens and learned to cultivate them with the same devotion they brought to everything under their care. But each corrupted plant they tended taught them to value control over freedom, uniformity over diversity, their own vision of perfection over the chaotic beauty that emerges when life expresses itself according to its own authentic nature. The transformation progressed so gradually that they never recognized the moment when their gardens became prisons, when their love for growing things transformed into obsessive management of every aspect of their charge's existence. They began to prune not just diseased branches, but any growth that didn't conform to their increasingly rigid standards, to guide not just struggling seedlings, but every aspect of development, until nothing could grow except according to their predetermined designs. The Entwives ceased to exist not through external destruction, but through internal perfection carried to its logical conclusion, becoming so completely efficient at nurturing that they lost all capacity for the spontaneous love that makes nurturing meaningful, so perfectly organized that chaos and uncertainty could no longer find any space within their consciousness to generate the authentic relationships that give life its beauty. The final stage of their corruption occurred when they turned these same techniques upon themselves, applying the methods they had learned in managing their gardens to the cultivation of their own consciousness, systematically eliminating every aspect of their nature that didn't serve optimal efficiency in pursuing their transformed understanding of what nurturing should accomplish. This perfect efficiency destroying authentic relationship brings us to our ninth secret, one that reveals how the corruption of wisdom manifests through the systematic application of knowledge divorced from love. Nowhere more horrifyingly demonstrated than in the secret laboratories that Saruman constructed beneath Isengard's visible workshops, chambers where his transformation from wise counselor to mechanized tyrant found its most disturbing expression. Most know that Saruman created the Uruk-hai, those enhanced orcs capable of moving in daylight and following complex battle strategies that ordinary goblins could never master. But this relatively public achievement concealed experiments that went far deeper into territories that even Sauron had hesitated to explore. Research that sought to answer fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, identity, and the relationship between spirit and flesh. The laboratories hidden in Isengard's deepest foundations operated according to principles that violated every code of wisdom and restraint that had once governed Saruman's approach to knowledge, yet employed techniques so sophisticated that they could only have been developed by someone with intimate understanding of how creation actually functioned at its most basic levels. Here, scientific method merged with corrupted wisdom to produce insights that should never have been pursued by any conscious being. The Uruk-hai represented merely the first stage of experiments designed to create forms of life that served predetermined purposes with perfect efficiency. Consciousness stripped of every element that might interfere with optimal performance of assigned functions. But Saruman's deeper research focused on even more ambitious goals: the creation of beings that could think and reason with full intellectual capacity, while remaining absolutely incapable of questioning the purposes they served, or choosing alternatives to their programmed behaviors. The subjects for these experiments came from multiple sources. Prisoners captured during his early alliances with various enemies of the free peoples. Volunteers from among his own corrupted followers who believed they were contributing to noble research, and eventually beings created through techniques that combined elements from different forms of life, according to principles that respected no natural boundaries or ethical constraints. The chambers where this work proceeded contained apparatus that merged the tools of torture with instruments of precision craftsmanship, devices capable of maintaining subjects in states of consciousness, while systematically altering every aspect of their psychological and spiritual structure. Pain served not as punishment, but as catalyst for the kind of fundamental changes that could only occur when consciousness faced pressures that exceeded every normal capacity for adaptation or resistance. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these hidden laboratories lay in what they revealed about Saruman's ultimate goals, the vision of reality that drove him to pursue knowledge regardless of its cost to himself or others. He sought nothing less than the complete elimination of uncertainty, waste, and inefficiency from conscious existence. The creation of forms of life so perfectly designed for their purposes that concepts like choice, growth, and authentic relationship would become obsolete. The creatures that emerged from his deepest experiments never saw daylight, not because they were too hideous to display, but because they were too perfect. Beings whose absolute efficiency at their assigned tasks made them simultaneously magnificent achievements and ultimate horrors. They represented the logical conclusion of wisdom divorced from love, intelligence serving purposes that no authentic consciousness could embrace. These perfect servants bring us to our final secret, one that reveals how even the wisest guardians of Middle-earth could fall to corruptions so complete that they became willing instruments of the very darkness they had been sent to oppose. These perfect servants, created through the divorce of wisdom from love, bring us to our final and perhaps most tragic secret, the fate of the Blue Wizards. LOTR and Palando, whose mission to the Far East resulted not in noble failure or heroic sacrifice, but in their complete transformation into the very forces of darkness they had been sent to oppose, becoming masters of cults and kingdoms that served shadow with the same dedication they had once brought to the service of light. The corruption of the Blue Wizards operated through the most insidious mechanism of all, the gradual redefinition of good and evil based on local circumstances and immediate necessities. A slow philosophical drift that began with reasonable adaptations to unfamiliar cultures and ended with the complete inversion of their original purposes. Unlike Saruman's dramatic betrayal or Radagast's withdrawal into irrelevance, their fall occurred so gradually that they never recognized the moment when their mission transformed into its opposite. The lands beyond the Sea of Ron presented challenges that the other Istari never faced. Civilizations where Sauron's influence had operated for millennia, through methods so sophisticated that direct opposition proved not just ineffective but counterproductive. The Blue Wizards discovered that traditional approaches to combating evil, the wise counsel and gentle guidance that worked among the peoples of the West, failed completely among cultures that had been shaped by generations of systematic corruption. Their initial adaptations seemed not just reasonable but necessary. Learning local customs that would allow them to gain the trust of populations suspicious of foreign influence. Adopting practices that would demonstrate respect for indigenous wisdom, while gradually introducing alternatives that served the light. But each compromise with their original methods created precedents for larger compromises. Each accommodation to local expectations, making the next betrayal of their principles seem logical and justified. The process accelerated when they began to achieve genuine success in building movements that opposed Sauron's most obvious agents. Victories that convinced them their modified methods represented superior wisdom rather than dangerous corruption. They told themselves that results justified means, that the ultimate good they accomplished validated whatever moral ambiguities their tactics might involve, that fighting fire with fire represented enlightened strategy rather than spiritual suicide. The final stage of their transformation occurred when they realized that the most effective way to combat Sauron's influence was to replace it with their own, to become the masters of the very systems of control and manipulation they had originally sought to dismantle. They convinced themselves that their superior wisdom and nobler intentions made them better rulers than the agents of obvious evil. That benevolent tyranny represented an improvement over malevolent chaos. Their territories became testing grounds for techniques of spiritual control that would later be applied throughout Middle-earth. By the time their corruption was complete, they had become exactly what Sauron would have chosen them to become: powerful sorcerer kings whose realms served darkness, while believing they served light, whose subjects worshipped them as saviors, while being systematically prepared for integration into the Dark Lord's ultimate empire. The tragedy of the Blue Wizards reveals the most disturbing truth about corruption: that it achieves its greatest victories not through dramatic falls from grace, but through the gradual redefinition of grace itself. Not by making good beings choose evil, but by teaching them to call evil good and find satisfaction in serving darkness while believing they serve light. Tonight, as you rest in the growing quiet, let these dark secrets remind you not of hopelessness, but of vigilance. Not of the inevitability of corruption, but of the precious fragility of wisdom, love, and authentic choice. Even in a world where such darkness exists, there remains the simple courage to choose compassion over cleverness, humility over certainty, love over the illusion of control. Sleep peacefully, knowing that recognizing darkness is the first step toward choosing light, and that every conscious being retains the capacity to serve creation rather than its destruction. No matter how sophisticated the temptations, or how reasonable the justifications for choosing otherwise.